Berlin, April 1945. The city was no longer a place, it was a wound that refused to close. The air hung thick with dust and the metallic scent of burnt steel. Buildings that once stood proud along Wilhelmstrasse had collapsed into twisted ribs of stone, and every gust of wind carried whispers of things buried beneath. The Red Army was closing in from the east, the Allies from the west, and amid the chaos the last fragments of the Third Reich were turning inward, devouring themselves in fear and delirium. In a devastated neighborhood on the southern edge of Berlin, beyond Tempelhof's smoking hangars, stood what locals called the Bauer house. It had been untouched by the bombings, almost miraculously. The roof remained intact, the walls straight, the windows sealed behind heavy wooden planks. For months people had passed by the house in silence, unwilling to look too closely. Something about it repelled curiosity. Dogs refused to approach its gate. Children whispered that screams could be heard on winter nights, muffled by the wind. But in a city where everyone had lost someone, silence had become a kind of survival. The Bauers had lived there since 1938, an unremarkable couple, Otto and Margaret, known for their discretion. Otto was a former railway clerk who neighbors recalled had once been kind, even timid. But by 1942, something in him had hardened. He joined the Volkssturm, the desperate militia of the final war years. Margaret, by contrast, was the shadow behind the curtain, never seen except when she carried a basket of bread to the basement door. The couple had no children of their own, yet whispers claimed they sheltered orphans from the bombings. At a time when charity was dangerous, that rumor alone was enough to make others look away. When Soviet troops entered Berlin in late April, their orders were clear: secure the streets, disarm resistance, and locate hidden civilians. One detachment, under Lieutenant Dmitry Ivanov, was assigned to sweep the southern district. The men expected to find only rubble and corpses. Instead, they found the Bauer residence, intact, locked, and silent. The gate was chained from the outside, as if to keep something in. Ivanov ordered his men to force it open. The wood splintered under the blow of a rifle butt, releasing a breath of stale air that reeked of mold and something else. Something organic, unmistakably human. They advanced cautiously through the dark corridor, the beam of a flashlight gliding over framed photographs on the wall. Otto in uniform, Margaret in a white dress beside a grand piano. A boy none of the soldiers recognized. Dust covered everything except the floor, which bore the marks of something dragged repeatedly toward the cellar. The trapdoor to the basement was bolted from above. When Ivanov lifted it, the smell grew stronger. His men hesitated. One whispered, "Deti, children." What they found below would remain sealed in Soviet archives for decades. The cellar was vast, its walls lined with brick and reinforced beams. But it was no ordinary shelter. Chains hung from the ceiling, connected to metal rings embedded in the walls. Wooden cots were stacked against the corners, each holding the frail remains of what once were children, dozens of them. Some lay curled as if asleep, others still had the straps of leather binding their wrists. Rats had done what hunger had begun. There were 47 in total, according to the count made 2 days later. The air was dense with decay and the faint sweetness of rot. In one corner, beside an overturned metal bowl, stood a large table covered in medical instruments, rusted scalpels, syringes, glass jars filled with a dark, congealed liquid. Papers lay scattered across the floor, some bearing the letterhead of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Most were unreadable, burned or soaked in blood. Yet one fragment, preserved in the margin of a notebook, bore a name: Dr. O. Bauer. The soldiers withdrew in silence. No one spoke. Lieutenant Ivanov radioed command, his voice trembling, and the building was immediately sealed. Orders came from higher up. Do not enter again. Await investigators. That night, rain began to fall over Berlin, washing soot from the streets, but leaving the stench of the Bauer house untouched. By morning, word had already spread among the locals. Some said the Bauers had worked for the SS, experimenting on children evacuated from orphanages in Poland. Others whispered it was a religious sect, obsessed with purification. No one could prove anything. Otto and Margaret were gone, vanished in the chaos of the city's fall. A week later, a Soviet unit attempted to exhume the bodies for documentation, but when they returned, the cellar was empty. The cots, the chains, the instruments, everything had disappeared. Only the walls remained, stained with faint, rust-colored marks that no amount of scrubbing could erase. For decades, the story of the Bauer family was dismissed as wartime hysteria, a grotesque rumor born from trauma. But in 1986, during the reconstruction of the Southern District, workers discovered a sealed tunnel beneath the foundations of the old Bauer property. Inside, they found fragments of glass jars, small bones, and the rusted remains of a child's bracelet engraved with a single word, Lisel. That was the beginning of the rediscovery, the beginning of what this file will reveal in its entirety. In the months before Berlin collapsed into ash and silence, the Bauer residents had already withdrawn from the world. The shutters closed earlier each evening. The garden, once neat and proud with Margaret's roses, grew wild and thorned. Neighbors remembered hearing the low hum of a generator at night, an oddity in 1944, when electricity was rationed to the brink of extinction. Sometimes faint cries slipped through the cracks of the basement door, but no one dared to listen closely. Everyone had something to hide in those days. Everyone was afraid of being seen. The first to notice the change was Frau Engel, an elderly widow who lived across the narrow cobblestone street. She had lost her husband on the Eastern Front and spent her days watching from the window, her only companion a radio that stuttered the latest lies of Goebbels. She often saw Otto Bauer returning home at strange hours, his uniform stained with mud, carrying wooden crates marked with the Black Eagle of the Reich. Once, she swore she saw a small hand reach out from inside one of those crates before he quickly covered it with a blanket. She tried to convince herself it was imagination, the mind's cruel trick under hunger and fear, but the nightmares that followed said otherwise. By December 1944, whispers had spread among the remaining residents of the district. They said Margaret had been visiting hospitals and bomb shelters, offering to take in abandoned children. "Just until the war ends," she would say, her voice calm, her eyes serene. She spoke like an angel of mercy, and mothers desperate for food or safety accepted. Some even wept with gratitude. Yet none of those children were ever seen again. Frau Engel recalled one particular night in winter, when the snow outside turned pink beneath the streetlight. The air smelled faintly of iron and smoke. Around midnight, she heard a carriage stop near the Bauer gate. Two soldiers, men in medical coats, unloaded something heavy wrapped in canvas. They disappeared through the side door, and moments later, the generator roared to life. The hum grew into a deep vibration, a pulse that rattled her window panes. Then came the sound that haunted her until her death, a long collective moan, neither human nor animal, that rose from beneath the ground and faded into silence. She tried to tell others, but no one would listen. To question a loyal citizen of the Reich was to risk everything. Otto Bauer, once shy and mild-mannered, had changed beyond recognition. Those who encountered him at the ration lines described him as pale, almost translucent, his eyes sunk deep and rimmed with sleepless shadows. He spoke in clipped sentences, avoiding contact, his hands gloved even in summer. The butcher swore he had seen him buy animal hearts in bulk, paying in crisp Reichsmarks when most used scraps of bread as barter. When asked why, Otto smiled and said, "For the children's nourishment. They need strong blood." No one dared question him again. Meanwhile, the Allied bombings intensified. Every night, sirens wailed as the city turned into an inferno. And yet, amid the chaos, the Bauer house remained untouched. One neighbor recalled seeing a greenish glow seeping from its basement windows during an air raid, like phosphorescence underwater. The next morning, the street outside was littered with the charred remains of birds, their wings stiff and eyes white as porcelain. Children said they dreamed of the house whispering their names. In February 1945, a letter circulated secretly among local clergy. It was written by a nun from an orphanage on the outskirts of Berlin. She warned of a collection effort conducted by civilians claiming to represent the children's relief of the Reich. The woman in charge, the nun said, introduced herself as Margaret Bauer. Her signature was immaculate, her credentials stamped with official seals. The nuns, grateful for aid, handed over 23 children aged 3 to 12. 2 weeks later, when they tried to reach the Bauer home to inquire about their welfare, the address was barred by armed men in plain clothes. "They belong to the Reich now," one of them said. "Do not ask again." In the weeks that followed, soldiers retreating from the Eastern Front passed through the district. Some stayed briefly at the Bauer house, claiming it was a designated medical post. A mechanic named Reinhardt, who repaired vehicles for the army, later confessed that he had been inside the basement once. He said it was nothing like a shelter. "It was a laboratory," he whispered to investigators years later. "There were glass tanks filled with liquid. Something was floating in them, small pale shapes that looked almost like children. And the doctor was humming while he took notes." When asked to identify the doctor, Reinhardt hesitated before muttering, "It was Otto himself." The most disturbing testimony came from a 10-year-old boy named Hans, one of the few who escaped. His story was dismissed at the time as delirium caused by trauma. He said he had been taken to the Bauer house in early March 1945 after his parents were killed in a bombing. At first, Margaret was kind. She bathed him, gave him bread, promised safety. But soon she led him to the basement, where he saw dozens of other children chained to iron posts, their eyes hollow, their lips cracked from thirst. "They told us we were special," Hans said, "that we were chosen to be purified." He described injections that burned like fire and a machine that took pictures of our blood. He escaped through a ventilation shaft when the power failed one night. He was found days later, barefoot and delirious, muttering the same sentence over and over. The walls were breathing. Even after the war ended, survivors of the neighborhood could not agree on what had truly happened. Some insisted the Bauers were simply victims of hysteria, a couple trying to protect orphans who died in the chaos. Others were sure the truth was darker, that Otto had been part of an underground research unit operating independently of the Reich, obsessed with the idea of creating endurance through suffering. When the Soviet archives were briefly opened in the 1990s, a file surfaced containing a single photograph. It showed the Bauer basement, chains hanging from the ceiling, and on the wall behind them words scratched in German, barely visible under a smear of blood. "Die Kinder singen, wenn sie schlafen." The children sing when they sleep. No one ever discovered who wrote it. But for those who lived near the Bauer house, the melody of that sentence still lingers in their dreams, faint as the hum of the generator that once pulsed beneath the earth. When the Soviet investigators descended once more into the ruins of the Bauer residence, it was late May of 1945. The war in Europe had officially ended, but Berlin still smoldered, a carcass steaming under spring rain. The Red Army now occupied the city like a surgeon dissecting a cadaver, and every house, every corridor seemed to bleed secrets. The Bauer property, sealed for weeks, stood as one of the last enigmas. Soldiers said they could hear faint metallic sounds from beneath the ground at night, chains clinking against concrete, or perhaps pipes settling in the damp soil. No one volunteered to find out which. Inside, the investigators found the basement door pried open, the padlock melted by fire. The air below was unbearable, heavy with ammonia, and something that smelled like old flesh steeped in chemicals. Floodlight beams pierced the darkness, revealing that the cellar had been transformed. The cots and chains were gone, yes, but in their place stood large glass cylinders, cracked yet still intact enough to display their content, a translucent fluid and pale, shriveled remnants of what once might have been organs. Each container bore a label, handwritten in neat German script, with the prefix VK followed by a number. Later translation of the field notes would reveal that VK stood for Versuch Kinder, experiment children. At the center of the room lay a desk, overturned, its drawers spilled open. Dozens of pages soaked with moisture described procedures with grotesque precision, injections of toxins, measurements of endurance, starvation intervals timed to the minute. The signature at the bottom of several pages was that of Dr. Otto Bauer, listed as consultant to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity and Eugenics. The institute, one of the Reich's scientific pillars, had been known for its studies on racial purity, often conducted with living subjects in camps like Ravensbrück and Auschwitz. But this was different. These notes did not seek purity. They sought resistance to death itself. According to one recovered journal entry dated February 3, 1945, Dr. Bauer wrote, "The children respond differently to deprivation. Some enter a state of stillness, their vital signs reduced yet stable. They do not die when they should. It is as if something within them resists decay. I believe the answer lies not in nourishment, but in the absence of it, in the threshold between life and cessation." Investigators found sketches of human figures, emaciated, skeletal but alive, connected to machines by tubes and wires. Each drawing noted the child's age, duration of fasting, and cognitive response. One sheet was marked with a single word in large red ink, Liesel. It matched the name engraved on the bracelet found decades later beneath the house. Through witness interrogations, a fragmented picture began to emerge. Otto Bauer had been part of a late-war project codenamed Operation Morgenhauch, Morning Breath. The goal, according to surviving documents, was to develop a method of keeping wounded soldiers alive longer on the battlefield through forced metabolic adaptation. Children, seen as pure and resilient, were chosen as test subjects. The program operated unofficially, hidden from Berlin's main research facilities as the Reich crumbled. And when the government collapsed, Bauer decided to continue the work alone, convinced that he was on the verge of transcending mortality itself. Neighbors later recounted that in those final days before the Soviet advance, screams came from the Bauer basement not of agony, but of ecstasy. Voices chanting, overlapping, until they became one continuous hum like a liturgical drone. Some swore the sound was mechanical, others said it was human. A soldier from Ivanov's division wrote in his diary that when he first entered the cellar, he could still hear a faint chorus, as if echoing through the walls. The tape recorder found nearby confirmed it. Reels of magnetic tape contained hours of children's voices, reciting prayers, nursery songs, and numbers in unison, followed by long intervals of silence punctuated by static bursts. Among the recovered documents was a small leather-bound notebook belonging to Margaret Bauer. Unlike Otto's methodical reports, her notes were intimate, almost devotional. She wrote not as an accomplice, but as a believer. "The children are chosen. Their hunger is not suffering, it is purification. Otto says that through pain they shed what is weak and approach the eternal. I can see it in their eyes when they no longer beg for food. They begin to glow." Another entry from March 15th was even more disturbing. One of them Liesel sang even as her voice broke. Otto recorded it. He said her song carried the frequency we were searching for. He believes sound itself can preserve the soul after the body fails. When this line was translated for the Soviet command, even hardened officers shifted uneasily. There was talk of the Bauer tone, a rumored experiment in sonic endurance, where frequencies emitted by suffering could influence biological decay. Soviet scientists seized the materials and classified them immediately, fearing parallels with their own post-war research into psychophysical control. The Bauer property was declared contaminated and sealed under military guard, but some pieces could not be erased. During the cataloging of evidence, investigators discovered a narrow hatch behind the basement wall. Beyond it lay a tunnel, stone-lined, stretching for several meters before ending abruptly in a chamber filled with stagnant water. Floating on the surface were fragments of cloth, bones too small to belong to adults, and the rusted casing of what appeared to be a ventilation unit. Etched into the metal plate above it was a phrase, corroded yet legible, "Nur durch Leiden wird der Körper rein." So only through suffering is the body cleansed. The tunnel suggested there had been another exit, possibly leading to the nearby forest. Yet it was filled in with concrete shortly after its discovery, under orders from the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. They took with them all documentation, along with several boxes of preserved samples marked in Cyrillic as biological artifacts. The official report concluded simply, "An unauthorized medical experiment site. All subjects deceased. Responsible parties unlocated." Otto and Margaret Bauer were never found. Some speculated they had committed suicide before the Soviets arrived. Others whispered that they escaped through that tunnel, aided by remnants of the Reich's secret networks. Years later, in 1961, a former SS medic captured in Hungary confessed under interrogation that he had worked briefly with Dr. Bauer of Berlin. He claimed Bauer was not attempting to create super soldiers, but to reverse death itself. The doctor believed the human body could be trained to sustain consciousness even after clinical demise, a concept he called Überleben durch Stille, survival through stillness. According to the medic, Bauer had once declared, "If God made man from dust, then man can return to dust and rise again by will alone." After his confession, the medic was found dead in his cell, throat slit, the walls around him covered in smeared fingerprints as though he had tried to write something before dying. His last word, deciphered from the bloodied tiles, was Liesel. To this day, no photograph of Otto or Margareta has ever been verified. The only surviving image, recovered from a damaged roll of film, shows a blurred figure in a white coat standing beside a child seated in a chair, electrodes attached to her temples. The figure's face is obscured by light. On the back of the photograph, scrawled in faint graphite, are the words, "The song continues beneath the ground." And so it did, or at least that is what the locals still claim. Construction workers who renovated the property in the 1980s reported hearing humming through the foundations at night, as though air moved through unseen pipes. The melody, they said, was faint, almost childlike, but when one of them tried to record it, the device captured only static and a single word whispered just before the tape cut off, Liesel. By 1947, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a scar stitched together by occupation zones, haunted by the ghosts of its own history. Rubble was cleared, streets reopened, and life, in its grotesque persistence, began to pulse once more through the veins of the capital. Yet beneath this illusion of rebirth lay a quiet, festering secret. The Bauer property, officially catalogued as Residential Ruin 47B South Sector, had been erased from municipal records. Soviet troops erected a steel barrier around it, forbidding entry even to local administrators. When asked why, the officers replied only that the area was contaminated. But there was no radiation, no chemicals, only memory, the most toxic substance of all. Those who had first entered the basement never truly left it. Lieutenant Dmitry Ivanov, who had commanded the initial discovery, was transferred to a remote psychiatric unit in Novosibirsk the following year. His wife received letters that made no sense, pages filled with drawings of circles and childlike handwriting, repeating the same phrase, "They are still singing." He was found dead in 1952, having drowned himself in the bath of his hospital room. On the wall, written in soap, was a single German word, hunger. The Soviet investigation into the Bauer case was classified under the codename Dossier Nr. 9, 34-5. Experimental Atrocities, South Berlin. The files vanished into the labyrinth of NKVD archives, never to be cited in any tribunal or international proceeding. Unlike Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, or Dachau, the Bauer site was never mentioned in the Nuremberg trials. There were no witnesses, no official victims, no photographs admitted as evidence. The Soviet command preferred silence. They had taken what they needed, notes, instruments, perhaps even preserved specimens, and turned the rest into ash. Rumors spread that the materials were shipped east, to secret facilities where Soviet biologists continued the research under new names. When the Berlin Wall rose in 1961, the Bauer property found itself swallowed by the eastern sector, forgotten beneath layers of barbed wire and concrete. A government storage building was constructed over it, its foundations driven directly through the old cellar. Workers complained of equipment malfunctioning underground, lights flickering, engines stalling. One engineer swore that when he descended alone to inspect a cable fault, he heard soft tapping from within the walls, like fingers brushing against stone. He refused to return, claiming the air whispered. The report was filed, then buried like all the others. In the West, the story persisted only as rumor. A few exiled German scientists who had once worked at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute recalled a Dr. Bauer in hushed tones. Some described him as brilliant, others as deranged. obsessed with endurance and the metaphysics of hunger. A declassified British intelligence memo from 1958 mentions an unconfirmed lead regarding human experimentation in the Soviet zone, involving starvation studies on minors. The document ends abruptly with the phrase, "Information unreliable, source deceased." Margarete Bauer's name surfaced briefly in 1973 when an East German archivist discovered an unsigned death certificate bearing her initials, MB, dated 1946. The cause of death: respiratory failure during interrogation. No body was ever located. Otto Bauer, meanwhile, became a phantom of the Cold War, rumored to have resurfaced under a false identity in Moscow, Prague, or Buenos Aires. None of these claims were verified, but the persistence of the name in intelligence circles suggested that the Bauers had become more than historical figures. They were now symbols of a truth too inconvenient to confront. The few who attempted to expose the case met quiet, inexplicable ends. In 1979, historian Dr. Friedrich Keller published a small pamphlet titled The Bauer Experiments, a Forgotten War Crime. It was based on fragments leaked from Soviet defectors, copies of medical diagrams, diary excerpts, and a grainy photograph of what appeared to be the basement. 3 months after the pamphlet's release, Keller died in a car accident on a deserted road near Leipzig. The original documents vanished. His widow later said that 2 men had come to their home days before his death, claiming to represent a Berlin reconstruction office. They took his typewriter and notes, promising to return them. They never did. Even after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, when archives were opened and secrets spilled into daylight, the Bauer file remained elusive. Journalists who searched the ruins of the old storage building in the southern sector found only a hollow cavity where the basement should have been. The earth had been scraped clean as though the ground itself had been sterilized. Yet beneath the concrete, Georadar detected irregular cavities, air pockets, tunnels that had been filled hastily. When the first team broke through one of them, a sickly odor escaped, and their equipment failed instantly. The excavation was halted for safety reasons. But the silence was no longer complete. Fragments began to reappear, small pieces, traded among collectors and archivists. A cracked glass cylinder, allegedly retrieved from the site, surfaced in Prague in 1992. Inside was a shriveled object resembling a human heart, suspended in dark fluid. Chemical analysis identified traces of formaldehyde, but also high concentrations of an unknown organic compound. The sample was confiscated by authorities and disappeared again. That same year, an old reel of magnetic tape was found in a defunct Soviet laboratory near Minsk. When restored, it revealed several minutes of static followed by faint children's voices reciting numbers in German. Eins, zwei, drei, and then a lullaby, cut short by a sharp metallic click. The recording ended with silence that somehow felt alive. The psychological toll of those who handled the Bauer materials became a case study in itself. Many reported insomnia, recurring dreams of being underground, and a persistent ringing in their ears, sometimes described as a hum, sometimes as distant singing. One translator assigned to digitize the documents in 1994 requested to be reassigned, claiming she heard breathing through her headset when the tapes were silent. Another, a historian from Warsaw, refused to continue, saying, "It's not history I'm reading, it's something still happening." Today, the official record remains contradictory. The German Federal Archives list the Bauer family as unverified civilians, presumed deceased 1945. The Russian archives deny the existence of dossier 9-34V. And yet, there are testimonies, too many to dismiss. In 2003, an elderly woman named Clara Engel, granddaughter of the original neighbor, gave an interview before her death. Her voice trembled as she recalled the night she followed her grandmother into the street and saw light leaking from the Bauer basement vents. "It wasn't a lamp," she said. "It pulsed, like something breathing. And when the wind was still, you could hear them humming, all of them together." No one knows what truly became of the 47 children. No graves were ever found, no records of burial or cremation. Some investigators believe their remains were destroyed in the early post-war cleanup. Others suspect they were moved east with the Soviet research materials. But among Berlin's older generation, there persists a darker theory, that the children never died at all, at least not in the way humans do, that they were trapped in a state between life and death, sustained by Bauer's experiments in stillness. A grotesque myth, perhaps, but one that refuses to die, whispered in bars and on construction sites whenever new foundations are laid in the south of the city. In the end, the Bauer family's story became not a chapter of history, but a contagion of memory. A reminder that truth can be more dangerous than ignorance. Every few years, someone new claims to have found a clue, a photograph, a tape, a diary fragment. Yet each discovery vanishes before reaching the public. Scholars call it coincidence. Others call it continuation. And still, on some nights when the city is silent and the rain falls softly on Tempelhof's ruins, residents swear they can hear the faintest echo rising from beneath the pavement, a low, rhythmic hum, like a choir without words. They say it comes from the direction of the old Bauer property. No one investigates anymore. Because in Berlin, everyone has learned the same truth the Bauers once understood. Some songs are not meant to be heard again. Berlin today. The city has healed on the surface. Cafes hum with conversation. Tourists pose beside remnants of the wall, and glass buildings shimmer where ashes once settled. Yet beneath the polished stones of Potsdamer Platz and the manicured lawns of Tempelhof, there lies a silence older than peace. It is the silence of what was never properly buried, the kind that hums faintly beneath the ground, waiting to be remembered. The Bauer house no longer stands. Where it once cast its shadow, now stretches a quiet residential block, children playing where other children once starved. To the unknowing, it is a place like any other. To those who have read the archives, what little remains of them, it is a site of unease, a wound disguised as history. Every few decades, someone digs too deep. In 2011, workers laying fiber optic cables unearthed fragments of glass and bone beneath the old southern sector. The site was immediately cordoned off, and the discovery dismissed as wartime debris. Yet one of the engineers, interviewed anonymously, confessed that the bones were small, not larger than a child's hand. He said the air smelled of rust and decay, but also something strangely sterile, like a hospital corridor long abandoned. Within hours, uniformed officials arrived, sealed the area, and replaced the soil with gravel. No report was ever filed. Berlin simply continued to breathe, pretending not to remember. But memory is a stubborn creature. It seeps through walls, hides in the grain of photographs, and whispers through the static of forgotten recordings. In the decades since the fall of the Reich, humanity has built museums and memorials to ensure that the atrocities of the past would never fade. Yet the Bauer case remains conspicuously absent, as though excised from collective memory, an infection walled off to protect the organism. The story, half documented and half denied, represents something far more unsettling than a single war crime. It is a mirror held up to the human instinct for obedience, for rational cruelty, for silence disguised as survival. For those who have studied the fragments, a question lingers. What truly drove Otto and Margaret Bauer? Was it fanaticism, pseudoscience, or a spiritual delusion that turned compassion into cruelty? The documents suggest a man consumed by the notion that suffering could purify, that hunger could refine the human spirit until it transcended death. Perhaps he believed he was saving those children, transforming their agony into proof of something greater. That idea, that horror can serve a higher cause, is the seed of every atrocity humanity has ever committed. From the camps of Poland to the cellars of Berlin, it is always born from the same conviction, that the end justifies the means, and that the suffering of the weak can be sanctified by the faith of the strong. After the war, the victors judged the guilty and rebuilt the cities. But some crimes escaped the light because they offered knowledge too valuable to destroy. In Soviet laboratories, fragments of the Bauer notes were quietly circulated, studied and rewritten under new codenames. Western intelligence agencies, too, were not innocent. Whispers of parallel research in American military hospitals surfaced in the 1950s, experiments on sensory deprivation and endurance, sanitized echoes of the Bauer obsession. The The same hunger for mastery over life and death simply changed its uniform. The methods grew subtler, the subjects anonymous, but the ambition remained. And so the Bauer family became more than a name. They became a shadow cast across generations of science and secrecy. Historians who encountered their traces often described a sense of contamination, as if the very act of reading their files carried a curse. Some claimed to hear faint humming when they handled the documents. Others experienced dreams of dark corridors and chains clinking in rhythm with a heartbeat. Rational minds dismissed it as stress, but others suspected something deeper. That memory itself has weight, that evil leaves an imprint on those who touch it. In recent years, filmmakers and researchers have tried to resurrect the story. A few have succeeded in piecing together partial reconstructions, interviews with locals, copies of diary fragments, the voice of an old woman recalling the song beneath the floor. Yet none have completed their work. Funding withdrawn, footage lost, archives inexplicably sealed, as if history itself resists being spoken aloud. It is said that every attempt to record the Bauer story ends with the same interference: static, distortion, a low frequency resembling human voices. When played backward, one investigator claimed the recording whispered a single word: "Bleib, stay." Perhaps the Bauers' true legacy is not in what they did, but in how the world chose to forget them. Silence became the final experiment, perfected through generations. How long can a civilization ignore its own reflection before it reappears? The Bauer children were not martyrs nor monsters. They were the evidence of how far humanity will go to dissect its own soul. Their suffering was buried not for their sake but for ours, because to remember them fully would be to admit that the line between knowledge and cruelty is thinner than we wish to believe. In a report declassified in 2017, a Russian historian noted an annotation scribbled in the margin of an old NKVD memo: "Truth delayed is truth preserved." It may have been written by one of the officers who sealed the Bauer property, or perhaps by a later archivist who understood that forgetting does not erase, it only postpones. And indeed, traces of the Bauers continue to surface. A laboratory register here, a medical sketch there, all leading back to the same unanswerable question: were they evil, or were they simply human? The most terrifying possibility is that they were both. Today, a memorial stone stands a few kilometers away, near a small park in Neukölln. It bears no names, only an inscription in German. Hier schweigt die Erde, aber sie vergisst nicht. Here the earth is silent, but it does not forget. Few people notice it. Fewer still know what it commemorates. And yet, on cold nights when fog drifts low across the city, the stone seems to hum, not with sound, but with a pressure that settles behind the eyes, as if something deep below still vibrates with unfinished sorrow. The Bauer story remains a forbidden archive, not because of the horror it contains, but because of the mirror it holds up to every generation that follows. It reminds us that civilization is fragile, that progress can rot from within, and that empathy, once silenced, becomes the most dangerous absence of all. The Bauers are gone. The children are gone, but their silence, that echo of breath against stone, endures. And so if you have listened this far, if you have felt even a fraction of that silence pressing against your chest, remember this: history is not something that happened to others. It is something that waits for us to forget, so it can happen again. The earth may be silent, but we do not have to be. This was only one of the countless stories erased from the record. One of the many that remind us that darkness thrives not only in cruelty, but in complicity. If you wish to ensure that these forgotten voices are never buried again, if you believe that remembrance itself is an act of resistance, then do not let this story fade. Share it, speak it, keep it alive. Because somewhere beneath the quiet streets of Berlin, the song of the lost still trembles, and they are waiting to be heard.